Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the CMVM, to this seminar on DLT applied to the capital markets. Today we'll explore the opportunities and the challenges that DLT present to the financial markets. And we are delighted to have such a great speakers here presented that responded to our call for abstracts, launched on October. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to give the floor to Luís Laginha de Sousa, Chair of the Management Board of CMVM, for the opening remarks. Thank you.
Okay, so, boa tarde. That's everything I'll say in Portuguese, just to make sure that everybody also understands that we are in Portugal, but this will be in English. So good afternoon. I would like to welcome you all to the CMVM and to this seminar entitled DLT Applied to Capital Markets. I have to say that it is with a great enthusiasm that the CMVM is hosting this event. And one of the main reasons for such enthusiasm has to do with the contributions of several academics and market practitioners who made it possible. This seminar not only is about DLT applied to capital markets, but it has also been designed around the same principles that characterize distributed ledger technologies. And I'm referring to openness, transparency, and decentralization. It also reflects our continuous effort to adapt to changing times, combined with the notion that for such adaptation to be possible, there is one key ingredient that we cannot discard, and I'm referring to knowledge. We also believe that a substantial part of the knowledge which is necessary to make this adaptation, it is increasingly emerging from the dialogue and interactions with external stakeholders, as well as from the careful interpretation of the vast amounts of information to which we now have access. So it's against this background that in October 2025, we launched a call for abstracts, inviting interested participants to submit to the CMVM by the 31st of December 2025, an abstract on topics related to DLT applied to capital markets. The abstracts we received were evaluated by the CMVM. Of those received, 7 were selected, 5 of which will be presented at this seminar. The authors kindly agreed to present their work at this event, and I would like to thank and congratulate them for sharing their work publicly today. A strong word of gratitude also goes to all those who submitted abstracts, even if they were not selected to be presented today. On the topic that is bringing us here today, I would like to share a few more thoughts. I believe it's not a surprise for anyone that the emergence of DLT has prompted an important reflection on the future of capital markets, because these technologies hold the potential to reshape the way financial instruments are issued, traded, settled, and also recorded. And DLT brings an enormous promise of contributing to greater efficiency, transparency, and resilience within market infrastructures by enabling shared and synchronized records across multiple participants. For regulators and supervisors, such as CMVM, this moment represents both a challenge and an opportunity. Our role is not only to ensure that markets remain fair, transparent, and functioning orderly, but also to foster an environment in which responsible innovation can take place. And although technologies evolve rapidly, the fundamental objectives of financial regulation, they remain constant to safeguard market integrity, protect investors, and also to promote financial stability. Ultimately, the development of and the adoption of distributed ledger technologies in capital markets will depend not only on technological progress or regulatory frameworks, but also on the engagement of market participants themselves. Financial intermediaries, market infrastructures, issuers, and investors, they all play a fundamental role in shaping how these technologies may be applied in practice. And one important reason is because innovation in capital markets has always been a collaborative process. It emerges from the interaction between technology developers, financial institutions, consultants, legal experts, academics, and of course also ourselves, supervisors. Each one brings a different perspective, and it is precisely through this diversity of viewpoints that more robust and sustainable solutions can be developed. This means that market participants, they are not just merely adopters of new technologies, they are active contributors to the evolution of market structures. Through pilot projects, research initiatives, and also practical experimentation, they help transform theoretically possibilities into operational realities. And at the same time, their feedback is also indispensable in ensuring that the new technological frameworks remain aligned with the needs of investors and the broader objectives of the financial system. And this brings me again to our session and why discussions such as the ones we will have today, they are so valuable. Bringing together academic research and market experience allows us to better understand both the potential and the limitations of these technologies. It enables us to examine the evidence, to question assumptions, and contribute to a more informed and balanced debate about the role of that DLT can play or may play in the evolution of capital markets. We hope that today's presentations and discussion will provide new insights, stimulate further research, and encourage continued dialogue between regulators, academics, and market participants. To help structure the discussion, today's seminar is organized around two panels with something in between that technology cannot replace yet. I'm referring to the coffee break, so we didn't manage to put that in the technology yet. The panels, they will address some of the central questions raised by the introduction of DLT applied to capital markets. So the first panel, revisiting financial intermediation in light of DLT, it invites us to reflect on one of the most fundamental aspects of financial markets, the role of intermediaries. Financial intermediation has long been at the heart of capital markets, supporting activities such as custody, settlement, clearing, and also the provision of liquidity. These functions, they contribute to one key ingredient, which is trust, also to efficiency and to the smooth operation of markets. DLT, however, has often also been associated with the possibility of disintermediation or with the transformation of traditional intermediary roles. And this raises important questions such as, to what extent might existing intermediaries evolve rather than disappear? What new forms of intermediation could emerge from DLT-based market infrastructures? And how might responsibilities, risks, and governance arrangements be redistributed among market participants? The panel will explore these questions by examining how technological innovation may reshape, complement, or redefine the functions which are traditionally performed by financial intermediaries. The second panel, which is challenges in the integration of DLT into capital markets, it focuses on the practical and institutional dimensions of adopting these technologies with the potential, while the potential benefits of the DLT, they are widely discussed, their integration into the existing market ecosystems, this raises more complex challenges. And these challenges, they include questions related to legal certainty, to interoperability with current infrastructures, to operational resilience, cybersecurity, scalability, and also regulatory alignment. There are also broader considerations regarding market fragmentation, cross-border coordination, and the need to ensure that innovation remains compatible with the fundamental principles that underpin well-functioning capital markets. And by addressing these issues, I'm sure that the second panel will help better understand what it means in practical terms to move from conceptual discussions about DLT to real-world implementation within financial markets. When these two panels are combined together, they reflect the dual nature of the debate around and surrounding DLT. On the one hand, a reflection on how market structures role may evolve, and on the other hand, a careful examination of the challenges that must be addressed for these innovations to be integrated in a safe, efficient, and sustainable manner. I'm about to finish, but before concluding, I just would like once again to express my sincere gratitude to all those who contributed to the organization of this seminar, in particular to the authors who submitted their work, and to the speakers who have kindly agreed to share their knowledge and perspectives with us today. The contributions are essential to fostering a thoughtful and informed discussion of these important developments. I would also like to extend a special word of thanks to all those who are joining us here in person. And I'm sorry if someone sits behind the pillar, but removing the pillar would bring a very serious risk to the building. So we've kept it where it is, but hopefully you can see it on the screen. So for all those who are here, a strong word of appreciation. And last but not least, a strong word of appreciation also to the CMVM team who has been organizing this event. I would refer 4 names in particular, and through them, all were involved, even if in a not so visible way. I'm referring to my board colleague and Vice President CMVM Inês Drummond, to João Vieira dos Santos, to Elizabetth Sequeira, and to Raquel, which I've seen here, Raquel Godinho. And with that, I have the pleasure now to give the floor to Elizabetth Sequeira, who will moderate the first panel, Revisiting Financial Intermediation in Light of DLT. I look forward to the discussion that will follow and to the insights that the speaker will bring on this topic. And I would like to thank you for your attention and wish you that you have a very productive and stimulating seminar with us. Thank you.
Thank you. For this first panel, I will call Hugo Coelho, Sami Alkhair, and Marta Boura to the stage, please. Welcome to this first panel on today's seminar on DLT applied to capital markets. This is an event where the CMVM gathers researchers, regulators, and also market participants to reflect on how technological innovation is reshaping the foundations of capital markets. In this panel, we will focus in a topic that sits on the center of this transformation, that is financial intermediation. We will revisit this relevant role in light of these innovative technologies. This session builds on the papers submitted by these authors. We have Hugo, Coelho and Sami, authors of Disintermediation and Reintermediation in Tokenized Capital Markets, and Marta, Boura, with her paper From Disintermediation to Reintermediation, the role of digital platforms in reshaping trust in capital markets. We will begin with the presentation of their papers, followed by a question and answer discussion, and then we will open the floor for further discussion here. So, Hugo and Sami, please start. Yeah.
Yes, perfect. Okay, I hope you can all hear me. Thank you so much. So, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Cambridge Centre for Alternative Finance, I would like to thank you for the kind invitation for us to present some of our research. In addition to myself and Sami, there's a colleague of ours who is not able to come to Lisbon, but who contributed to the research. So I just wanted to make a reference to him. His name is Hatim Hussein. So as Elizabeth has explained, so our paper focuses on the dynamics of intermediation or disintermediation and reintermediation in capital markets that result from the application of distributed ledger technology. In our presentation, we will first spend a couple of minutes discussing the concept of tokenization and explaining how it is being adopted in capital markets. Then we will set out 3 different scenarios for how the markets can evolve. And we will present 3 case studies showing how the markets are being disintermediated, but also reintermediated, either because of market dynamics or because of regulatory dynamics. So if I may start, just a few words about the center. So we're a research center associated with the Cambridge Judge Business School. We provide courses for we conduct research on digital finance, provide courses for regulators, and advise regulators across emerging market economies on introducing their regulatory frameworks for digital finance. We cover areas such as digital assets, open banking, digital ID, and artificial intelligence. Tokenization, as I suppose most of you would know in the room, but allow me for a short introduction, refers to the application of blockchain and smart contract technology to capital markets. So it changes the way we represent assets and we transfer them, and it facilitates then all sorts of new activities and products. Now, we're at the stage that we describe as a chasm in terms of the adoption of the technology. So there has been a period of, if you want to use Schumpeter's words, which I kind of like, there's been a period of invention where the technology was invented, a period of innovation where it was applied and there were some initial use cases. We're now moving to a period of diffusion, where this idea is being widely adopted in the market by the pragmatists, as you can see in that chart or diagram, which represents the adoption curve of a technology. Now, we're in a chasm because, well, for a number of reasons that I'll discuss in a second, but it is the market is struggling to adopt. While there's immense interest in this, the market is not widely adopting it. And there is a role for governments and regulators to help the market overcome the chasm, and that will be through signaling of policies and the clarification of regulations or the adoption of regulation, where again, public authorities see this as a desirable outcome. There's been many papers around the barriers to the adoption of tokenization and what factors explain it. So I think on the barrier side, we see the lack of legal clarity, and legal and regulatory clarity is often mentioned in surveys by the industry. The difficulty in integrating payment rails and finding a digital a settlement asset is another factor that is very often mentioned. So to put it simply, it is not sufficient to tokenize the asset side of a transaction unless the cash leg, the cash is tokenized as well. You will not be able to reap the benefits of this technology, so it sort of needs to move in tandem, the different parts of the system. There's also, obviously, some need for coordination among participants in the market and the fear of unintended consequences that hold people back. In terms of the drivers of, or the reasons to adopt the technology, the potential for efficiencies and the modernization of capital markets ranks very high and is widely recognized by regulators. And the fact that it enables you to, it basically facilitates the circulation of capital and the attraction of international capital. So when we think about the use cases of tokenization, we, in our paper and in other pieces of research that we're developing, we tend to distinguish between the market activities and market segments. And you might have some advantages and some risks, obviously, in applying the technology to these activities. So, for instance, like post-trade activities, custody is fundamentally different than what you see in traditional markets. You can also think of use cases in terms of the asset class. So some asset classes, the benefits of tokenizing them will be much higher than the benefits of tokenizing others. I think the BIS has a paper where they explain that tokenization of stocks will generate small efficiencies because it's already a very efficient market. The tokenization of liquid assets has huge potential in terms of creating new efficiencies. Just to finalize the introduction, when you think about tokenization, we're basically talking about these two layers that you can see in the diagram at the bottom in the middle. So there's a smart contract layer that is used for representing the asset. Basically, you take a real-world asset to a smart contract, and the smart contract produces a mirror image or a token of that asset. And there's the blockchain that is basically the register where that keeps the record of this same asset and records any transfer. In terms of the differences to traditional finance, as I think you'll be familiar, this is widely mentioned, there's the potential for fractionalization and therefore broadening of access of the assets by investors. This is a big topic in emerging market economies, but also in Europe that is trying to channel savings, retail savings, divert them from the banking sector to capital markets. So fractionalization is a potential benefit. Automated compliance is another one that is widely mentioned alongside programmability. So those are the more techie advantages. I'll hand over to Sami now, which will discuss the scenarios, how we see the market evolving, the structure of the market evolving, and the rise of new players as a result of the application of the technology.
Thank you, Hugo, and thank you for having us today. So I'll just be building on what Hugo mentioned. Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. Hopefully you can hear me better. I can hear myself better. So yeah, I'm just going to take us to, I would call it more of a thought experiment, this section. So this is really building on what Hugo touched upon earlier. So typically, our research has tried to focus more horizontally or holistically when we talk about the implementation or application of tokenization. So instead of like looking at a single product and its issuance, you try and look at it across the life cycle. And of course, tokenization can touch many different types of asset classes. And here we try and just develop this more holistic view of how the capital markets might change in terms of different scenarios. So we've outlined kind of 3 different scenarios where we've measured the rate of adoption and the degree of openness. So adoption, when we talk about that, we mean how much of, I guess, capital market participants or intermediaries have embedded this technology. And when we talk about the embedment of the technology or its implementation, is like how deep has it been implemented? So how much of traditional activities have been, let's say, digitalized as a result of tokenization? And the second kind of variable of openness, we really think about how easily can capital flow between different intermediaries that share a common infrastructure, or how strong are the interoperability mechanisms there. So we'll go through each of the scenarios, so where we look at how they might change. But just as a pretext, when we apply this scenario analysis and we try and visualize the capital markets, we can think about it through 2 axes. So the market segment, so if we can think about it more of a trade life cycle, and then the participants, so the intermediaries and the end users. So for each scenario, we'll try and think about what gets displaced and what type of capital market function gets disrupted, and who are the new types of participants that might become, who might be introduced or might become play a bigger role in this new system. So here for a high adoption, low openness scenario, we've kind of stylized that you kind of have the different segments still quite separated, but intermediaries can cut across some of these segments, but not across all of them. So we see the tokenization platforms kind of unifying the primary and secondary market functions. And you see kind of what Hugo touched upon, the role of regulators, a wholesale CBDC kind of acting as that settlement asset. And of course, the custodians play a much bigger role here because you have high adoption and you don't necessarily have the interoperability mechanisms. Your custodians who hold the assets kind of cuts across the different intermediaries. So they're the kind of common denominator here. So here we kind of see some disruption, but not as significant as the second scenario where you have high adoption and high openness. So in this scenario, we would see your post-trade functions kind of collapse. And when I say collapse, I mean smart contracts, or the programmability of smart contracts basically automates or embeds a lot of those post-trade or back office functions across the trade life cycle. And again, we kind of see a lot of disruption and some new kind of players in terms of either existing players transforming and kind of providing more of a technology or tokenized platform, or kind of completely new players from a technology point of view, which I'll come on to in a second. And then we have the third scenario, which is your low adoption and high openness. And I would actually like to think about this as what we have currently today. So low adoption means a small segment of the capital markets has tokenized their instruments, and tokenization acts more as a vertical than a horizontal, and it's more closely embedded with the crypto asset markets. And that's where you have the high openness element, where you leverage the capabilities and technology innovated from the crypto sector and have that as a gateway to tokenized instruments. And then you can kind of, we won't go into it now, but for the purpose of completion, you can expand this type of analysis and introduce a third vertical or market participants, which is your information providers, and then carry out this analysis, which includes the information providers. So we're talking more about the technology firms here, or blockchain technology-based service providers. So this is kind of just more of an illustration of how capital markets can change depending on the different adoption dynamics and how different participants integrate or play into the capital markets. And I think this is again, I said it at the start, more of a thought experiment, and it's mainly trying to move us away from looking at it from a vertical point of view to a more horizontal point of view or holistic point of view, because I'm speaking maybe from my own experience as a regulator at the FCA. A lot of the tokenization initiatives from a regulatory perspective has been maybe product focused, but very little has been looking at it kind of from a cross-cutting perspective. And in the interest of time, we just put kind of the, I guess, the storytelling for each scenario in the annexes, which I'm sure will be shared. But we'll go into the use cases now. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. So I think Sami is described what we see as some of the possible scenarios for the evolution of the market and how the market is evolving. Obviously, regulators have a big say over this because regulation is, to a large extent, the prescription of intermediation, because it's the service providers, in many cases the intermediaries, that give regulators a hook to impose rules, someone to hold accountable for the activities that are taking place. And we see that the regulation is very much about defining these roles and the obligations that come for the entities performing these roles, and especially centralized entities where you can identify someone responsible. So the title of the paper, as I think we've said at the start, is how it's disintermediation and reintermediation in financial markets. So we're going to, in this section, just try to illustrate how this might look like from a regulatory perspective, and share with you 3 case studies of what we're seeing happening in some jurisdictions that is changing these roles and changing the intermediation models. So again, as a way to set the scene, in a traditional model, what you have today, and building on the scenarios that we've just discussed, capital markets rely on multi-layers of financial intermediaries. So if you see the diagram at the top, especially the central part, you see these different layers. It starts with a trading venue, and then behind that there's a central counterparty, or under that there is a CSD and a custodian, and finally there's the RTGS, where the settlement takes place, or where the exchange of the reserves. In a fully disintermediated model, which would be, in theory, enabled by blockchain, as we've discussed, you basically have a peer-to-peer trade between the issuer and the investor. What sits in the middle is a decentralized tokenization platform, which is basically linking to a smart contract and the blockchain network. What we're probably seeing in the market, and again, this links back to the scenarios that Sami drew out, is a market-driven reintermediation, where we see the emergence of technology providers that act as interfaces or enablers. So these are actors that are providing the tech. They're no longer providing a service in the traditional sense of the word, therefore they're not in scope of financial regulation, but they are a fundamental piece of the puzzle or a fundamental cog in the chain through the provision of technology. Now, moving to the case studies, we wanted to illustrate how regulators are reacting to this by either enabling disintermediation in a controlled manner or prescribing new forms of reintermediation or prescribing new reintermediation rules. We purposely avoided the DLT pilot regime because you probably know more about this than I do, and I don't want to be caught making a mistake, so we cheated there. But the first one is the digital security sandbox, which is relatively similar to the pilot regime, is the UK version of the pilot regime, if you want. A bit more flexible, as the Brits like to do. But it is basically, it's a sandbox where it does two things. It waives or it exempts the providers of some service from some of the rules in what in European terms would be MiFID and CSRD. And it enables some form of vertical integration between the trading venues and the CSDs. So this element of vertical integration is not possible in traditional markets. It will be possible under the DSS. And as I said, I think the pilot regime is relatively similar, but we didn't investigate it on purpose. Another interesting case study is what we've seen happening in Thailand, where they created this new service or activity for which they require a license. And it is for the companies providing the what they call ICO portals, or you could think of it as the tokenization platform. So you have an issuer. The issuer needs to go typically goes to these companies to basically create the token. These companies provide the smart contracts, the tech that creates the token. Now, what the Thai regulators have done is they say, if you're an issuer, you want to issue certain kinds of token where there's rights attached to those tokens, so different than crypto assets. So in MiCA or in EU terms, assets not under MiCA, everything else. So you need to do the issuance through these ICO portals, licensed ICO portals, and these entities are responsible for or are subject to rules that are designed to protect consumers. So they need to make sure that the issuer does the appropriate disclosures. They might need to do some appropriateness or suitability tests on the end user. The third case study that we want to explore, that we're going to explore in our paper, is a regulation that was announced by the Japanese. It hasn't been published yet, so there's some elements of speculation here, but what they said publicly, I think, is enough to enable us to put it here. So they are basically introducing a registration requirement for technology providers, in particular wallet infrastructure providers. So I tend to think of it as the Fireblocks regulation, because Fireblocks being one of the major providers in this space. And so they're going to require them to register with the Capital Markets Authority, and they will impose as a minimum operational resilience obligations on these providers, a bit similar to what we have in Europe under DORA. But I think the scope here is slightly different. They're purposely targeting some of these infrastructure providers, again, I no longer know off the top of my head how DORA was constructed, but I think there's a slightly difference in scope here. This is relatively regional, and it is being discussed, especially in the industry, with some concern as a big expansion of scope on the part of regulators. So I'll just hand over to Sami to finalize.
Yeah.
Just 1 minute.
Okay.
How much do we have?
1 minute.
1 minute. Okay, wow.
Sorry.
So just to, I guess, summarize the kind of last slides, you know, I talked about the scenarios, and Hugo was kind of discussing about the role of regulators, probably needing to correct this asymmetry of tokenization adoption and regulation focus on the application of tokenization on financial services. And that's where we see we're in this scenario where there's probably a lot of openness because you have the technology to enable tokenization, but you don't have the regulatory framework to necessarily apply it concretely across different market segments or products, etc. And I guess here, again, we'll try to be very brief. It's just more of a framework to kind of move away from looking at tokenization in a very isolated way. So a lot of tokenization initiatives are cross-cutting or horizontal, I guess, not vertical, and therefore it needs to have that holistic approach from a regulator's perspective, both the multiple different teams that will be impacted from one regulator and also cross-regulatory, so central bank, the capital markets authority. And I think, generally speaking, having a framework to address it from a holistic point of view is important. And you start off kind of understanding what are the different outcomes you want to see from the adoption of tokenization, what are the different regulatory levers that you have to pull. So what can you do, or how can you achieve it? So your regulatory levers can be policy driven, so legislation, sandbox, guidance, or it could be strategy driven. So public-private partnerships, collaboration, developing infrastructure, or communicating with industry. And then your last segment is probably the type of intervention. So are you looking at an activity specifically, so custody, or a product like securities, or something more cross-cutting like operational resilience? And I'll skip over this. This is an example of how it's being done in practice, but I think this is probably more interesting. So we've kind of looked at all the different kind of key jurisdictions that have been pulling these regulatory levers, and those jurisdictions that are leading in terms of developing a framework around tokenization are actually pulling more of the strategic levers, and that's primarily because they're low effort, high impact, compared to the regulatory levers, which, again, from a legal perspective or sandbox perspective, is a lot of effort, even though it might be high impact. So, yeah, that's more than 1 minute. So, so I think, yeah, well, I'll conclude with that.
Thank you to both. Marta?
Of course. Thank you. So, well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start by thanking the CMVM's organization for inviting me to be here, especially to discuss, disintermediation, and more importantly, reintermediation as challenging, transformative ways of getting trust, and also reshaping capital markets, as I'm about to discuss today. So, as to the agenda, well, as you know, disintermediation represents the elimination or reduction of traditional financial intermediaries in transaction, communication, or validation processes. My point is, while this seems like a purely technical evolution driven by blockchain platforms or overall digital innovation, what we are witnessing in the market is something far more profound, which can be described as the reconstruction of trust and how it can be maintained in capital markets. So basically, this is the point. And in order to get there, well, I have structured this presentation in two critical yet interconnected dimensions. First, the challenges that are posed by reintermediation, trying to move beyond the simple narratives of technology replacing institutions to examine how, well, power, information, and risks are redistributed in complex ways. And second, the so-called challenge of trust. So basically, the fundamental shift. Do you hear me? Oh?
Yes.
Perfect.
That's fine, I think.
If not, please just say it's fine. But as I was saying, the challenge of trust, I mean, the so-called fundamental shift in the trust paradigm that goes from institutional trust to algorithmic trust, which is particularly argued within the blockchain environment. So this is the basis for today's presentation. I start with some assumptions and findings. Let me just say that these are some preliminary conclusions to my ongoing research, so please obviously feel free to share your views and thoughts. It's actually a very exciting discussion, so I'll try to stick to the point so I don't get lost in time. But, well, first, moving on these assumptions and findings, I would say that contrary to the promise of eliminating disintermediation, empirical analysis reveals that traditional intermediation has been actually reconstructed. So as of today, digital platforms actually assume critical gatekeeping functions and control access, setting terms, and extracting value from network effects. And the entry of big tech into financial services has actually been representing the most consequential dimension of this reintermediation. So basically, we are talking about companies that possess vast quantities of data, which control critical digital infrastructures, therefore DORA implications as well, and can cross-subsidize financial products with revenues from other lines of business. So authors have been identifying three interrelated processes known as reintermediation, consolidation, and capitalization in relation to this big tech that are actually, at this point, transforming the basis of competition in retail financial markets. So the first ideas would be that, well, first of all, disintermediation does not eliminate traditional intermediation, but reconstructs it, especially through platform-based operators. That would be the first idea. Also, network effects and data advantages create winner-take-all dynamics, which favor platform consolidation in the market. And also another point I'd like to highlight here is that a hybrid regulatory approach combining entity-based and activity-based regulations would be required to address this paradigm. The second point I would like to bring here today relates to the fundamental shift I was stating before from institutional to algorithmic trust. And the idea is the displacement of economic and informational power towards operators that lie outside the regulatory perimeter actually confirms the risk of shadow banking in these particular platforms. So on this environment, the conclusions would be first, that algorithmic trust does not replace institutional trust. Actually, institutional trust is far more essential now than ever, as we will see. And also that regulatory supervision must extend ex ante to code and technological architecture, not merely to exposed conduct. So we would be talking about a two-track regulatory approach required first technical standards and auditing for the operational layer, combined with the traditional institutional regulation that would be applied to governance layer. So those would be mainly the ideas. And, well, in order to get there, just some introductions to the point. Having this in mind, of course, the promise of disintermediation is compelling and has captured the attention and imagination of both technology enthusiasts and market reformers. the main idea, which will be important for the conclusions, is greater transparency. So we are talking about a frequently cited advantage as transactions become more visible in distributed networks rather than hidden within institutional black boxes. Enhanced traceability of records follows naturally from this transparency, since blockchain and similar technologies create immutable audit trails. And most tangibly, as is often pointed out, we see lower transaction costs as the fees that are charged by multiple layers of actors tend to be reduced or eliminated. So all of these benefits would, in principle, create an improved market efficiency, therefore fulfilling a long-standing objective of the financial market and also the market design. But what we see instead, and what emerges now, is this new complex landscape of reintermediation, where new and often unregulated actors assume the functions of traditional intermediaries, especially through these big tech platforms. So this would be the case with which critical questions arise, namely regarding, well, regulation, market power, concentration of information, which would be one of the more critical points, and then the very nature of these digitally mediated markets or environments. So from a conceptual point of view, I think this is the main idea. Disintermediation should be understood as a spectrum rather than an absolute state or a binary condition, so we rarely see complete elimination. Instead, we observe varying degrees of intermediation alongside the emergence of these new intermediaries playing an important role in the market. So in order to discuss this first part, so reintermediation, we can identify three main scenarios of disintermediation in European capital markets, each obviously presenting different features, opportunities, and well, regulatory challenges. The first one, in a very summarized way, would be crowdfunding platforms that directly connect entrepreneurs and project initiators with well, prospective or potential investors. The idea is the platform itself plays this new form of intermediary, one that curates projects and validates information, manages investor relations. So basically, intermediation has not disappeared, it has just changed form. And more crucially, it relies on different regulation, often lighter regulation standards when in comparison. The second scenario would regard to DLT systems, which comprise also blockchain, which represent perhaps the purest expression of this intermediation vision. Yet even here, we see that reintermediation creeps into various channels. So someone must maintain the infrastructure, has to manage access rights, ultimately resolve disputes that inevitably arise and ensure compliance with applicable laws, or provide the interface through which the users will get to the system. So again, the functions don't vanish. What we see is that they concentrate in the hands of protocol developers or wallet providers or node operators, or mainly platform operators. And the third scenario, it's more directly regarded to the big tech platforms, usually offering financial services, either directly or indirectly, within the vast commercial ecosystem. So they are technology companies or e-commerce platforms or social networks, yet they provide financing or payment services or lending, and increasingly, as the studies reveal, they actually intermediate capital seekers and capital providers in this context. And this scenario perhaps represents the most subtle and most transformative way of reintermediation, one in which the intermediary is so integrated into the daily digital life of the users that the function of intermediation is not visible across the chain, and mostly it's not visible to the final user. So this is the main concern in this point. Obviously, all of these scenarios are linked by this reintermediation phenomenon. Well, which comprise both challenges and opportunities. I would like here to highlight 4 challenges. So the first one regards to the concentration paradox. So digital platforms, by their very nature and economic logic, tend towards monopolistic or oligopolistic structures due to several events, so network effects or economies of scale in data accumulation, etc. Traditional financial intermediation was distributed across multiple agents. So typically, no single institution would concentrate all the functions of intermediation. Digital intermediation, by contrast, concentrates multiple functions within single entities which have a dominant presence in the digital ecosystem. So this is the first big challenge. The second one concerns two data asymmetry problems, which are very different from those in traditional finance. So big tech platforms leverage data from the user's entire digital ecosystem, which can comprise, well, shopping patterns and browsing behaviors, social connections, data location, etc. So when such a platform offers financial services to a user, they know way more about potential borrowers or investors than an institution could ever know or discover through conventional credit checks or a know your customer procedure. So we have a lot of data that is actually customized towards these services. The third one, which is an old one actually, involves the cross-border governance vacuum that arises from the mismatch between these digital platforms' global nature and the regulatory's typical territorial approach. So as digital platforms provide their services and activities globally by design and by necessity, the territorial approach of regulation can fail to address the entirety of these activities. And finally, the fourth challenge I would like to highlight here concerns to the opacity of algorithmic reintermediation, which is an irony because the transparency is actually one of the key benefits of the disintermediation process. But the black box creates accountability issues that are very different from those in traditional finance, where at least regulators could, in principle, review human decision-making processes or governance structures or control frameworks, which do not apply here, at least not directly in the big tech environment. So these regulatory challenges require definitely extending the regulatory perimeter so that the rules and oversight may apply whenever and wherever issues of consumer protection and market integrity or systemic stability arise. A central question here is whether regulation should be focused on entity or activity, so the dilemma of what firms are / what firms do. And the principle of same activity, same regulation has been advanced internationally as a means to ensure competitive neutrality and to prevent regulatory arbitrage. Yet this principle finds practical limitations when applied to digital platforms, and that's the point. So currently, there has been an alternative in discussion. So it is recommended double approach, a hybrid one, by which it would be recognized 2 points. First, that these platforms can perform multiple activities simultaneously. And second, that the risk arising from those activities may differ depending on the entity that is providing them. So for example, in a payment service that is operated by an institutional agent, a bank, for instance, the systemic risk is very different from when in comparison to a digital platform that provides the same payment services but controls a dominant digital ecosystem. So this would be the approach. Moving on to the trust, and well, regardless of these different approaches, significant gaps still remain across all jurisdictions, and now focusing on the supervisory topic, there are main challenge of supervision on this regard, which are mainly 3. First, the technical capability gaps. So the regulators and supervisors were not tailored to address this kind of issue, and legislation is not yet still adapted to do it. Also, a very difficult one, the ex ante versus ex post dilemma. So the idea is that the ex post exercise may not work in this environment. So when the risks are identified through complaints or examinations, well, the harm is already done. So this would recommend or suggest a shift to ex ante analysis by forcing regulators or supervisors, in this case, to review and approve the algorithm behind it. Which raises another question to which I don't have answer, which is, well, two, should regulators approve the algorithm of the platforms that actually operate in this digital ecosystem? And if so, would they be held liable for the potential or real risks that come and arise from it? And this is something to take into consideration when rethinking trust and the supervision exercise. And finally, a more practical point is the data access paradox. So digital platforms generate vast amounts of data, which potentially enables for more intensive supervision that has ever been made possible with traditional operators, where regulators had to rely on periodic reports or occasional examinations. The thing is, and that is the result of the paradox, the supervisory systems are not often designed to deal with big data and how to treat them. So they would be left in a situation where they would be drowning in data they can access, but without being able to find the specific data to assess the platform activity or risk or report. So from a practical point of view, that is an obstacle on supervision. We are having all of this in consideration, indeed witnessing a complex phenomenon that creates new forms of trust alongside the old ones. So I would say that institutional trust remains essential and perhaps more important than ever. Even the most decentralized DLT requires trust in those who govern the protocol or maintain the infrastructure, especially with the new European regulations about it, and to ensure ultimately that the system serves the user's interests, not the operator interest. But algorithmic trust introduces new elements to these equations. So there's trust in code transparency, the idea that we can verify how a system works by getting into the code, and that the digital platform's whole operation depends on this exercise of, if it gets into the algorithm, then the result is a commercial assessment due to that algorithm. So I would say that that is true. There is algorithmic trust or transparency, but that relies on having the mechanisms to understand the algorithm, which most of the users lack. So for regulators and supervisors, the challenge would be to ensure that both institutional and algorithmic trust remain well-founded and justified in order to perform the activities in this particular case. And I'm sure we'll have more opportunity to discuss this form of trust. But for now, with these thoughts, I would like to conclude with three fundamental points that I hope you take away from this presentation. And obviously, the risks and opportunities that may come when in relation to the reshaping of the regulation. But first, yes, trust must be established somehow. And the challenge is to ensure that these new intermediaries are subject to appropriate oversight and that they follow the functions they actually perform rather than the legal form they adopt or the technology that is employed. The second is, the international regulatory framework has been evolving rapidly, but these gaps still exist and no jurisdiction has come to address them. So this discussion we're having here today is fundamental and very urgent, actually. And third, it is important to address the supervisory capacity in order to make sure supervisors can keep up with all of these, complex landscapes mainly, and this has been the answer that has been highlighted in this regard, with sub-tech capabilities and investment in systems in order to make sure that this is all taken into consideration. So for smaller markets like Portugal, the major risk would be that we become rule takers rather than rule makers, considering our specific market and how these relations are established. But there lies the opportunity as well to start now rethinking about this strategic development and how we can address all these issues regardless of this European environment. So I guess that's it, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much for these presentations that were very interesting and very comprehensive of the risks, the shift in the paradigm. I would like to start following the work from Hugo and Sami. As you know, conceptually, DLT was expected to democratize finance through the disintermediation. Yet, and as your presentation showed, intermediaries have a great role in digital asset markets today. From your research, is the industry moving closer to decentralization, or are they simply reinventing intermediaries under this newer technological architecture?
Okay, sorry. You go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think there's, we need to clarify some of the terms of the question, because I think most of us, for convenience, we use the terms disintermediation and decentralization in the same sentence and interchangeably. Now, these are different concepts, because disintermediation is, well, as the name says, there's someone in the middle, right? Someone that connects two sides. Decentralization, we define it as where the power or the control over, let's say, this intermediary is distributed in such a form, in such a way that no individual exerts control over this intermediary. So you might have a scenario where there's still intermediation because there's a platform that sits in the middle, but because no one has the power to dictate what that platform does, no one can change how it operates, then it is decentralized. And I think the French wrote a 200-page paper, the ACPR, about this. So I'll stop here in terms of concept. But this is a difficult one because the two terms usually go together, even though they're slightly different. Now, what we're seeing in the market, as we try to demonstrate there, is that we're seeing a replacement of intermediaries that operate within the scope of regulations that perform financial activities as you define them in the regulations. And they're being replaced by tech providers or tech companies that provide the interfaces or that enable these things to happen, the financial activities to continue to operate. Now, when you think about the tech stack, this is happening at the top of the stack. At the bottom, you have the blockchain, which is the settlement layer, or the register, where the transactions are registered. And the blockchains, in the sense of Bitcoin and Ethereum, these are purely decentralized. Again, as I said here, what you have is entities that are centralized, so they're not decentralized. They perform intermediation not in the sense that you know in financial regulation, but they enable financial activities or they provide interfaces. And the question for financial regulators is, are you going to expand the scope to capture these guys? As we've demonstrated with the Thai example, with the Japanese example, with the DSS is a bit different because it's enabling disintermediation as opposing to re-intermediating through regulation. So again, what we're seeing in the market is tech providers that are centralized, replacing traditional intermediaries. what we see the regulators doing is trying to bring some of these in scope, or creating new activities, defining these interfaces and facilitators as activities that need to be regulated.
Yeah, I would just add or stress the point that, you know, the benefits of the technology doesn't make the kind of all the processes or steps in the life cycle disappear. It just consolidates that into a different type of service provider. And it's the shift of, okay, we've always had outsourcing arrangements, we've always had an understanding of critical third parties, but the amount of accountability that we've asked or put upon these third-party providers has been via the financial institution that outsources or uses these services. So I think the shift is probably, or at least trying to understand, as you digitalize capital markets and different financial functions, how do you shift accountability? And a challenge that's raised, and I think it's very common with technology firms, is a cross-border element. So this is where, okay, we need to shift where accountability is held, and therefore we extend the scope. That's from a functional perspective, but then from a geographical perspective, where and who is providing these services and what type of coordination is needed. I think from a European perspective, you have very strong regional cooperation, but that becomes increasingly hard the more you go up to the international level. I speak from experience, working at a regulator at the FSB and IOSCO levels on crypto, and that's probably the hardest place to agree or gain consensus, because you have different jurisdictions with competing ideas of what crypto regulation should look like, and it's quite evident on how it's been playing out. But I think regional cooperation is probably the first step to understand how you tackle it from a geographical point of view, but then it's understanding what are the new types of intermediaries that is providing that technology service, which captures the old services that were originally provided by traditional intermediaries. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Marta. Your work focuses a relevant topic that is trust. Should policymakers treat technological trust in code, differently from traditional institutional trust?
Well, thank you. And I believe that distinction represents one of the major challenges of this era when dealing with these new agents, and particularly in the big tech environment. So, as I said, trust in code is fundamentally trust in a mathematical and logical certainty. So when a blockchain validates transactions through cryptographic consensus, or a specific smart contract executes following a programmed feature. So the trust involved is of a different kind than trust in human institutions. It is verifiable rather than reputational. So I believe that is where we can draw the line, and in order to help that assessment, maybe taking into consideration 3 dimensions. First, the operational trust, which concerns to whether the technology will do its own function, which regards to this trust in the technology or in the algorithm. Then we'll have the governance dimension, which regard to know who controls the technology and who manages the perimeters and what recourse exists when everything goes wrong. And that is purely institutional. So we need to address issues of power and accountability and legitimacy that no amount of code could ever fully address. And third, we would have the contextual trust, which regards to the broader ecosystem in which the technology operates. So the legal enforceability of on-chain agreements or the reliability of oracles that connect blockchain. That again regards to a mix of technology as to what it is possible and to regulation as well, so the human intervention as well. So all things considered, when it comes to policymakers, I would say the main implication would be as to the supervisory exercise, which connects to the ex ante approach that I was discussing. So supervisors would have, under this new and full environment, to distinguish and extend their exercise to an ex ante, to code and to cover also the technological architecture, which actually is now mandatory in some ways in the financial market, for example, DORA, to ensure that they have the resilience in order to provide for solutions and to respond to incidents, etc. The assessment would be similar in order to understand exactly how this agent operates and how it handles the risks of the potential results of their activities. So there would be the two-track regulatory approach. So to distinguish first these technical standards and auditing in order to address, and tests in order to address the operational layer of the business, and then the traditional financial regulation that would be applied to the governance structure, which implies that this structure is known and fully understood by regulators and supervisors, again, depending on the operational structure. So all of this is combined. Of course, we could say from a theoretical point of view that these, what I'm saying, obscures important dependencies. So the code itself is made by humans, and the technology itself is also made by humans, and all the structure. So it could be artificial from a, I don't know, theoretical point of view, but in practice, businesses distinguish these two levels, and they have different risks and effects in the market. So I would say yes to distinguish and to make that difference between the institutional trust for a more governance idea and the operational trust regarding to these algorithmic or technological basis trust overall.
Thank you. We will have around 6 minutes, and I would like to open the floor for any questions from the audience. Yeah, someone can bring a micro. Wait a minute.
It's coming.
We have one here and then a second here to José Miguel.
Thank you very much. Very interesting, your presentations. Very thoughtful and thought-provoking. My question is the following. What we can see nowadays, at least at European level, but as well in UK and the United States, is, for instance, in some areas of market infrastructures, some changes. For instance, United States moved to T+1 settlement, and UK is en route for that, as well as Europe and Switzerland. So my question to you is the following. Have you studied the DLT and its technical capabilities? How do you cope this development from ancillary services in relation to this technology? Are they forgetting or skipping the potential of DLT? And the second, what is the reason for some players saying that they prefer to arrive late than to be wrong regarding these technologies? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I can go first. So in terms of why is is a step being missed in terms of moving to T+1? Because I guess if we were to settle on a blockchain, you have atomic settlement, T+0, really, instant settlement. I think there are two different types of risks. And if you have immediate settlement, you'll need to, you might reduce settlement risk, credit risk, but then you have a new type of risk that you have to manage around liquidity or availability of liquidity. So you need to have some sort of pre-funding model to be able to meet the instant settlement requirements. With a T+1 or T+2 model, you already have liquidity facilities and market operations to kind of manage kind of the availability of liquidity and settlement and counterparty risk. And also you have existing market infrastructures that sit in the way of that. So your clearinghouses or CCPs, which will be managing longer maturity derivatives, etc. So the whole market structure has been kind of built on top of one another, and moving to T+0, I guess, doesn't make sense because kind of what we were talking about earlier, you need that kind of holistic approach. You can't tokenize or implement DLT in one area of the life cycle or trade life cycle or market segment and not do it across the chain. It's almost it's almost like a puzzle that you have to complete. So you almost need to do it across the different market segments for it to make sense and embed all the different kind of risks, management systems, etc. One thing that's, I guess, is interesting and almost a barrier to why you don't have this is almost like chicken and egg situation. You don't want to be running parallel systems or two different systems that you then have to reconcile. But again, you want to move to a more efficient way of operating. So it's like, how do you or where do you embed this technology in order to achieve it? And then your follow-up question, I kind of forgot because I was rambling. What was your last question?
First mover.
Was regarding to arrive late or
Arriving late instead of arriving and being wrong. Yeah. So that's an approach, like I'm speaking from the UK perspective, that we took. So let Mika be implemented and then learn from Mika. So instead of saying arriving late, you'd almost phrase it as being a second mover or gaining the second mover advantage. But then you have other jurisdictions like Singapore who have been first movers, but again, I'll link back to kind of one of the slides we were talking about. They exercise different types of regulatory power. And Singapore is a unique case because the conduct regulator and the central bank is a single entity. And they also have rulemaking power. So they're able to exercise a lot of different initiatives to see the benefit of the technology. Whereas if I think about it from the UK perspective, you need a lot of different authorities to coordinate to actually move. So almost moving second, as we used to say, was better because there was a lot more governance and logistics around actually making a move towards initiatives surrounding tokenization.
Maybe just 20 seconds on the last one, and I think you gave a very sophisticated answer. I'll simplify it. It's like, in social terms, you don't want to be the first one to go to the party because there is no one to dance with, right? Like, I think that's the conundrum that the industry is facing, and that's the chasm. Like, it is very expensive to be the first one. There's no one to trade with on the other side. That's why we see one of the measures to create these markets comes from governments who issue tokenized government debt, just basically to provide one of the key pieces of the markets, and then the others come in. Like the EIB has been pushing through with this technology, not because they particularly like it, but because, again, they need to create the markets and they feel that there's a signaling element and there's a liquidity element in that.
Yeah, there was one hand that... And quick, if you could be briefly, because we are at the end of the section.
Thank you very much.
No, you can. You may ask.
Now, I have to confess that I was very excited with many things, ideas that you proposed to us. But I have a kind of a problem of being, as a lawyer, as a practitioner. I feel that sometimes you were talking about things that were very volatile, and I fear that the legal security and legal certainty is somewhat out of your ideas. And I want to understand more or better if this DLT is just a way of communicating securities from one side to the other. I have to understand how will I exercise my rights over these securities, namely if I have security that is pledged to a bank, sorry, but I'm on the side of the banks, how can I exercise my rights? If I can go to court, which court can I use? It can be a kind of a mess.
So I think I'll give a short response because I'll wear my regulator's hat now because these are some of the problems that we were dealing with. So I spent a lot of my time doing regulation for crypto assets. And I think there needs to be a distinction between crypto assets and tokenized securities or securities that are represented digitally. As you said, there are different rights associated to them. And there are different, I guess, there's not necessarily an underlying right to Bitcoin, but there is to a share. And I think where there needs to be more legal clarity, or at least regulatory clarity, is around what are some of the gray areas and some of the gaps that are created from using this technology. So, for example, if you can't identify a technology provider that, maybe a better way of thinking about it is when you hold your digital token, right, that represents a security or whatever, that digital custody over a blockchain looks very different, and there are different types of risks associated to that custody. So for me, it's more around, okay, we've defined what rights exist. How do you provide clarity around your rules to ensure you protect those rights? And I think legal clarities, or regulatory clarity at least, is one of the biggest hurdles, at least from my experience working in the UK regulator. That's what we always heard from industry. And from a UK perspective at least, we take a very principle-based approach to regulation, so very much outcomes focused. So we might be prescriptive in certain ways, but we'll define a specific outcome that needs to be achieved. And then the regulated entity will have, I guess, room to operate and find out how they will achieve that outcome. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Sorry, just a quick question, a follow-up question on what you mentioned and linked to something that I not fully understood regarding Marta's perspective, which is how to make this compatible with the ex-ante versus ex-post supervision. So, because if I understood well, the need to have some kind of trust in technology, in the algorithm, you need some kind of ex-ante perspective in supervision. But when you mentioned that actually you focus on the outcome, aren't you considering more flexibility ex-ante, but then I don't know if this is the case or not. It's a question. I'm not going to try to answer it. So.
Yeah, so I think, I'll just add one thing. Yeah, one perspective. I think there's this challenge or a reality that there's a level of risk or reality that you kind of have to accept. But if you can create a more regulated space for people to operate, it creates a clear barrier between the unregulated or unknown world and then the known world. And right now, those lines are kind of blurred because there's that asymmetry between adoption or use of that technology versus the amount of regulation that is accounting for this technology. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way is also accepting that, okay, you have open source code, which you can't really necessarily regulate. And I don't have the answers, but that's an area, especially from an operational resilience point of view. How do you manage the risk from open source code? It's not an easy answer, but at least taking that outcomes-focused approach and trying to create almost a regulatory barrier at least helps distinguish between the unknown and create a space for the known knowns.
I think, well, following up on that and agreeing with that analysis from a photographic point of view, that is, as I understand exactly how these issues have been dealt with. So there is this gray area to which we cannot reach and to understand exactly what are the risks involved, but the way, when we see the digital ecosystem as a whole, when we look at the AI Act or the DORA or NIS2, we find this need to go look to the algorithm and to understand exactly what are the potential risks that arise from it and to make a responsibility allocation based on that. So following that line, I just try to give a step forward on that direction. So knowing that is the case, what would be, considering the full impact of these activities and, well, the statement that from an empirical point of view that most of the harms that are caused by an activity have their roots or origins in the algorithm, how can we address this configuration of algorithm in the supervision? So we are allowing a big tech to perform certain activities as we do in a typical company, but we cannot fully understand the risks of that activity and the regulatory potential risk that comes from it. So that would be the idea, to divide this operational phase and the governance stage to fully address these two environments. Well, in theory, because I don't know if we can even that fully address operational layer or to understand everything about it, but at least to make the legal point of view here, to understand the risks that may arise from it, and that should be reported or followed or anything.
Just a couple of points to complement. I think one area where we've seen this ex-post ex-ante regulation playing out in European rulemaking is in the competition space, where you had the Digital Markets Act, which is basically ex-post antitrust law, just put in ex-ante form. Because the conclusion is you cannot really oversee or apply ex-post competition law to these big platforms, because once the arm is done, there's no way back. Therefore, they've introduced the DMA. So I think that's the best example, but you're still, at this stage, you're still talking about centralized entities. The difficulty with blockchain is that they're decentralized in some cases. These are contracts that were written, that are in code, someone put them there up in the ether, and you cannot change them. So, and I think most people frame this discussion as how are you going to regulate DeFi, which is what is outside of MiCA. And in very simple terms, there's two things. You regulate the interfaces, you regulate the entry points, and this requires you to expand the scope of regulation to capture these entities that are tech, but not really, because they're so fundamental to the provision of services that it's game for you to bring them in scope. The other thing is you need to prescribe the standards, or you need to get the industry to agree on some standards for how these smart contracts are written and work. And only these certified smart contracts or protocols or whatever can be accessed by regulated entities or can be accessed by the interfaces. So if you say that there's this interface that most people use to trade crypto, and you regulate it, and you say to this interface or to this entity, you can only touch protocols that meet certain requirements or meet a certain certification. You sort of tackle the two sides, and one is ex ante, one is ex post.
Yeah,
Exactly.
our time has ended. Thank you so much for your enlightened presentations and discussion, and all of you for participating and joining us today. We will have a break now, and we will resume at 3:50.
Okay, welcome back. We'll begin our second panel that will focus on the challenge in the integration of DLT into capital markets, and I'll call the speakers, António, Garcia, Rolo, and Luiza Castro-Rey, here to sit with me. Please. So, our second panel will focus in the challenge, as the previous one already had challenge, and also from a legal perspective. So now we'll focus also in that area because we have here two profiles that are legal ones. And thank you so much, first of all, for presenting and to submitting your paper, your abstracts, in the call for abstracts. The first is Luiza, that is going to present her topic about DLT-based market infrastructure, technical architectures, regulatory constraints, and implications for capital market supervision. You have also some colleagues that work with you in your paper that I can also name them: Mariana de la Roche, Juan Ibanez, and also Laura Caetasi. So thank you, Luís, and you can start. Yeah.
Do we have this?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So as João said, this paper was a collaboration. My colleagues unfortunately could not join us today due to conflicts of agenda. So this was in collaboration with Juan, which was in Mica Crypto Alliance, Mariana, which is from Black Vogel, I'm from Fear Legal, and Laura is also from Black Vogel. Being Laura the most technical one out of us, she was the only one without a legal background, which brought us some more robust side on this tech side. So once we started this paper, we wanted to take a look in DLT in that slightly different angle. So not only on the technology topic, but in legal and regulatory design problem that comes with it. So in this space, the architecture is not just technical, it also brings legal consequences to it all. So why does this matter was the first question that we brought this to life when started. And the key idea to keep in mind from the start is the DLT in capital markets is not driven by innovation by its own sake. It's shaped by legal constraints. So once we were developing this, the key point that all of us kept going back was why regulators care, or what do they care about once we're talking about this technology. And we reached three very concrete things there, which is when the transactions are final, who is responsible if something goes wrong, and how they can actually supervise each of the systems that are put in place. And with this, we saw that every design choices that are made along the way, especially in the beginning, affects every single one of those 3 points. So with this in mind, and having also in mind that we are in a very specific moment once we're talking regulatory-wise, on which the EU framework is, currently live. Other jurisdictions outside of the EU have gone further than we have in a lot of the points. And, now the EU is starting to clearly scale up. We are starting to reach this problem at this point. So it's no longer a question of if, but it's a question of how. So for the paper we're presenting today, specifically, it's built around the 4 questions at hand, which is when a transaction is legally final, who is accountable, where does the ownership actually sit, and last, how the supervisors actually see those systems. So if we simplify things, there are 5 technical choices that everyone should make in the DLT space, which is network type in the sense permission versus permissionless, consensus, design, so if it's democratic or problematic, so in the proof of work, proof of stake, token model, programmability, and governance. Token model being if it's mirror or reference token, or if it's a native token. And on the governance, they operate on the control chains, audit trail, and all of that. So in practice, all of this actually will collapse in one single issue that will be the settlement finality. So this is the decisive constraint that we see in practice. So in capital markets, the transaction must become legally reversible, protected in insolvency, and also fully auditable. And this is why, in reality, everyone ends up more or less in the same place once we're talking about the EU ecosystem, which is permission systems. And not because they're better technologically at all, but because they're the most compatible with the laws that we have in place right now. So once we're talking permissions, the type, so permission and permissionless, and to make all of this very concrete is permissionless systems, they don't give you a clear identity, they will not give you a deterministic finality, and they will not give you a very clear accountability, which creates immediate issues for regulations and for regulators. Whereas, on the other hand, the permission systems will be the ones that will let you know who participates. The transactions will be final in a very deterministic way. And the governance, it's very, very clear on that. So if you want to run in a regulated infrastructure market, this is basically not optional. So that's why everyone tends to default to more or less the same place. With this in mind, what I said that was the core point of it all, which is the settlement finality. It's actually indeed the most important point of this whole presentation, and all of our conclusions are kind of drawn to this one point, that is, a transaction can be confirmed in the blockchain, and that same transaction can still not be legally final. Once we're talking transaction, it's just not the monetary money passing away to the other, but any blockchain transaction that can be selling stock, selling real estate, or whatever it is. So the block can be confirmed, and that can be confirmed on chain and still not be legally binding. Because for finality to exist, three things we need to align, which is the technology, the system rules, and the law. And when one of these don't fully match the reality, you don't get the real protection. So from a supervisory perspective, this means you don't trust the system, you gotta test it. So once we were talking to different regulators also on how to approach this, we kind of reached kind of a checklist from the practical point, which is you have to ask when you're in the project side, can this be rewound? What happens on this system under stress, and when is the legal moment defined? So finality is not a feature, it's something that have to be demonstrated again and again. Then for the next point, we'll have the tokenization models, which is where, well, the whole hype have been, at least once we were talking to our clients in this side. And there's two very clear models there. First, the mirror model, which is when the token represents something that exists elsewhere, and the legal ownership stays off-chain. So the whole transaction can happen on-chain, but you would still need an off-chain act to make the ownership being transferred. For example, real estate in Portugal, which is one of the most latent cases that we receive a lot. You can do the purchase and sale on-chain and have everything legally binding there, but if you don't put that to the registry, it will not be legally binding in real life. So you still need that off-chain component to it. And the second model is the native model, where the ledger itself is the legal record. The ownership also exists on-chain. So both of those moments converge into one without needing the need of this off-chain moment to it. And this difference is kind of fundamental because in the mirror model, you always have the risk of the blockchain saying one thing and the legal registry saying a different thing. Then, well, conflict. And that creates a very, very big legal uncertainty for whoever is involved in those acts. Whereas in the native model, since those two moments exist in the very same time, it's much more clear from the legal perspective. And well, given our legislation today, the EU mostly uses the mirror model, whereas other jurisdictions like Switzerland manage to have the native model converge in their own regulation. So ownership, for example, in Switzerland or in Liechtenstein, is very much more clear because they directly tackle this, whereas the EU is still a step back on this. And then smart contracts. Well, they're very often presented in a fully automated compliance way. So, but that's not really accurate once we present that. They work in a very, very well for like simple and binary rules. So for example, is an investor eligible for this? Have this date passed? Does the threshold trigger a report? Yes or no? There is no evaluation behind it, so binary parts. They would not work, on the other hand, for judgment, proportionality, and anything that requires further interpretation. And then comes the oracle risks, because smart contracts, they only know what they are told. So if the system input is wrong or equivocate, let's say like that, the system will produce something that looks valid, but is legally wrong. And this will then create an even bigger issue, which is who is responsible. Because in traditional markets, it's very clear who the decision maker is. You see who's the decision, you can link that to responsibility. Once we're talking Oracle and smart contracts, that creates an even bigger problem. That's in the EU, we don't yet have an answer for that, which is part of the big problem on the probability here. With that, we say that we reached a Portugal framework with a triadic structure, which is a fairly structured system, once we're talking, especially in the EU context, because here we have the DLT pilot regime, MiCA and DOTA, and the CMVM is structured in the very center of it. I mean, you guys will know a lot better than I do on this. But what is important in practice here is because the operators will be dealing also with market regulation, crypto regulation, and ICT regulation, all in the same time, all at once. You cannot segregate one from the other. So this also brings a little layer of complexity extra there. But at the same time, it simplifies, because once you have one regulator in the center of it all, so one authority in the center of it all, that also means, normally, with the countries that we work with, that you have specialists sitting on those chairs that understand what's going on, so you'll not be at mercy of, you know, a random person, the authorities that have no idea, and you have to explain everything from the beginning. So these infrastructures, they're not just financial, they're also technological and operational systems, which is why once we were reading this paper and we saw the central part of the CMVM, in this sense it brought comfort, because we already dealt with other authorities that we had to explain from zero what the technology was. And once you have to give this 10 steps back, once, especially in complex systems like that, it just turns everything even more difficult. With this, we will zoom out a bit to the more global context, because globally, the approach is a bit different than what happened also in Portugal. So some jurisdictions like Switzerland have already solved the legal question of ownership, as I said previously, which the EU haven't, at least not explicitly. And the pilot regime was a very, very good start, to be honest, but it was still very limited. And what's interesting now is the kind of the direction of travel, because now we have a bit higher thresholds, we have more flexibility, and likely permanence. So we feel like we're kind of moving from experimentation period to a more closer to a real market infrastructure itself. Yeah, almost there. So we reached the one practical reality that will be fully on-chain systems are not realistic as we see today, at least not with the current legal framework that we have in place, because you always need an off-chain component to it, as we were saying. That will be either for identity, for cash, for legal interventions. So we get the hybrid systems, and this raises normally a quick question, that is, how does the supervisors accesses the system? And we reached two options on there. There will be one, either a direct access via node, or two, via structure reporting. But the key point is, either of these choices need to be put in place and designed from the beginning. You cannot add supervision afterwards. So this is something that we often tell projects that need to be in the very core of the beginning of it. So to conclude all of this, sorry, I'll skip this one. We'll finish with 3 points. First, the EU is scaling the DLT, but it still haven't fully answered whether ledger equals legal ownership. 2, automation creates new accountability gaps, which we have to have an accountant for. And 3rd, supervision needs to be built from day one. So ultimately, this, as we said at the beginning, this is not so much of a technological discussion, but also like how to build a legally robust market infrastructure on it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Luiza. Now we'll have António presenting his presentation is direct tokenization and securities law, the viability of the token form as the primary form from security representation. Please.
Hello and thank you. First of all, good afternoon to everyone. I would like to thank CMVM and of course João for their interest in myself sharing my thoughts on direct tokenization of securities and its implications for Portuguese law. I commend of course CMVM and its team for setting up this amazing event and the way it's always positioned itself as a key forum for the discussion of the impact of DLT in the securities market. I'm very happy to be here and to share my thoughts with you. I will skip my presentation in order for economy of time. You can look it up on LinkedIn. So I'll jump right in. What am I talking about when I talk about tokenization, which is a word that is thrown around, thrown around in legal fora, thrown around in social media. What are we talking about? Well, tokenization is often defined as the representation of financial or real-world assets, like more tangible assets, in a digital form represented on a blockchain or another DLT. Being represented in a blockchain, in summary, can mean that the blockchain is the technology used to determine the ownership and therefore the legitimacy of transfer of a given asset, of a given tokenized asset. One can think of tokenization as a new form of representation of a legal relationship, a bundle of rights or obligations, or a value. Just as paper was an old form, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, just as paper was an old form of representation or inscription of rights, such as those embedded in a share or a bond, or registration in an account or a book entry. It is important to clarify that despite the historical context in which token, crypto asset, or digital assets have emerged as separate definitions, I'll use token and crypto asset and digital asset interchangeably. If someone is interested on why, ask a question afterwards. But I'll use them indistinguishably. So tokenization, on a first look, it does look like the process of transforming a pre-existing real-world asset, be it a security or a tangible asset, into the form of a token, presupposing two moments. So a pre-existing moment in which the real-world asset exists empirically or even legally, and the second moment in which a transformation occurs, a metamorphosis occurs, and the tangible asset or the security is now represented by a crypto asset. However, empirical reality is more complex, and it would be ill-advised to look at tokenization as a mere process. Indeed, in legal and technical literature, tokenization can refer to different legal, technical, and contractual structures. For myself, I like to follow the classification proposed by Xavier Lavoisier. You have there the reference to the article, and he basically distinguishes. Of course, these are all approximate classifications, as all classifications are, of course. but he basically distinguishes between direct or native tokenization, which Luís has also alluded to, where tokens or crypto assets are the primary form of the asset representing legally enforceable acts, in which one could include tokenized securities, in their proper sense, I'll come to that later, or for instance, CBDCs could eventually also be considered a form of direct tokenization. And the assets are usually not represented in other forms. Then indirect tokenization, that's when you see, if you go on social media and see, oh, we're tokenizing this, we're offering tokenized shares, bonds, whatever, it's usually indirect tokenization structures. So basically structures in which the tokens represent rights, either contractual rights to a certain value or to a certain cash flow, or in rights over an intermediary structure controlling the assets and are backed by the original asset or contractual claims. One could, for instance, replicate the traditional SPV securitization structure in this manner. For instance, many cases of tokenized real estate work like that, so you probably own a tokenized share over a company or a structure that then owns the real estate, so you don't own the real estate. Commodity-backed stablecoins are also a great example of indirect tokenization, and it is also very common to see contractual structures advertised as tokenized securities, but which are in reality derivatives or adjacent contracts. In such structures, you may own a token representing a derivative contract relationship that gives you the right to certain cash flows depending on the performance of a given stock or a given index. Besides these two categories, I can also, which Lavoisier defines as complete tokenization, there's also a category of incomplete tokenization, which overlaps a bit with what Luiza has talked about in the mirroring assets. So basically, the tokens do not fully embody any legal rights, but have mostly informational value. Well, tokenization of rights as obligations and tangible assets, of course, has obvious advantages. I don't need to replicate disintermediation, speed, 24/7 market, so on and so forth. It's good for the markets. It's also good for investors because they can own maybe fractionalized parts. Sorry for the redundancy of assets they couldn't otherwise acquire. And it's also good for issuers because, well, it's more efficient, quicker, transparent collection of equity and debt, and expanding the reach, of course, of potential investors. Now, having made this introduction to tokenization, it is time to determine the exact scope of the technical side of my presentation. I will only focus on direct or native tokenization of securities under other laws and also under Portuguese law. In this case, the tokenized form, so basically the representation of securities in this tokenized form, either originally or subsequently. So the security itself is born as a token, or it subsequently becomes a token. In this case, a tokenized form is just another way to represent the bundle of rights and obligation that is a security. Once again, as paper was the original form of securitization of certain rights and obligations in order to make their transfer easier historically, and as paper evolved to book entry registry, we are probably in the cusp of another comparable technological leap from traditional book entry securities to tokenized securities. Let's see how the law can address and acknowledge and adapt. So basically, legal frameworks that directly address direct tokenization of securities are few and far between, but we see more of them every day, and they seem to work in some identifiable ways and have been focusing on securities. I'll draw a distinction here between acknowledgement of tokenized securities and then bespoke or specific tokenized securities frameworks. So for the first one, this is the more basic but the most effortless in a way, in a form of approaching tokenization of securities. In this form, when legal frameworks look at crypto assets that represent securities-like characteristics, usually known as investment tokens or security tokens, they apply traditional securities laws to those crypto assets. Here, tokenization per se does not have a legal framework, but tokenized securities are treated as something akin to book entry securities. That is the default position in the EU in the absence of specific member state regulation. Article 2, paragraph 4 of MiCA acknowledges that crypto assets that qualify as securities should be subject to securities regulation under the technological neutrality principle. MiFID II has been changed to include an explicit reference to DLT form for financial instruments, a category wider than securities, as, of course, the audience already knows. So it thus acknowledges direct tokenization of securities under a technological neutrality principle, but it does not provide a bespoke framework for them. The EU DLT pilot regime develops that route by introducing a pilot regime for DLT market infrastructures and their operators, but it does not address directly the issue of tokenization. Despite EU law's acknowledgement of tokenized securities, it is up for the national laws of the member states to develop further. So we have some interesting examples. I'll lay out 3 examples in the EU: France, Germany, and Spain. So basically, I'm talking about legal acts and frameworks that directly address the procedural and the legal aspects of the process or the status of tokenization, be it direct, in this case, direct. So basically, in these cases, the tokenized form can be the exclusive formal representation of a given security. The three examples I'll give, they have securities laws which have been modified to recognize tokens as those primary forms of representation. Very quickly, and at least my reading of the French regime is that for some years now, the Monetary and Financial Code foresees direct tokenization and treats tokenized financial instruments as a standalone category in par with paper instruments and register or book entry instruments. Its Article 1211.3 says that financial instruments issued in France and subject to French law can be registered in a registry book held by the issuer or by an intermediary or through a distributed ledger technology. So the DLT in itself, of course, must have some characteristics, and the operator, but it's still a quite relaxed regime in what it concerns the operator of the DLT, more relaxed than the German and the French one. And the new provisions themselves allow explicitly for issuance in tokenized form at the issuer's discretion, with a registration in a DLT being undertaken in the name of the holders of the tokenized assets. The code also allows for the seamless transfer of tokenized securities within a DLT. The technical transfer allowed by the DLT codes is, for all legal purposes, an effective transmission with no further formalities. So that is really important to underpin direct tokenization. As long as the DLT confers legitimacy, the law recognizes legitimacy. And it also acknowledges a regime for conversion. So you can pick up a traditional security and convert it to a tokenized one. In Germany, which has been long seen as a very backwards jurisdiction in terms of security representation, which has been almost paper exclusively up until very recently, the 2021 Electronic Securities Act allows for the issuance of what they call electronic bearer financial instruments, listing 2 types of electronic financial instruments and securities. Electronic security registered in a central registry, only evidence in digital form, or a crypto security entered into a crypto securities registry. Once again, the regime itself is not that different from the French one. It allows direct issuance of securities in tokenized form. It allows conversion. The prerequisites applicable to the DLT operators, so the crypto security registers, are a bit heavier than in France. And the Act, curiously, specifically clarifies that the crypto security will have the same legal status as a paper-based security and will be considered a thing for the purposes of the German Civil Code. Once again, another example of a bespoke regime. And finally, in Spain, in the new 2023 securities market law, it explicitly foresees tokenization, once again, with the same kind of overlying principles as we saw in France and in Germany, so possibility of issuing directly, possibility of conversion, imposing, of course, a specific authorization, like in Germany, for the operators of a DLT itself. So it can be anything, must be specific DLT operated by a specific entity subject to certain rules. So what can we make of these 2 groups of legal approaches? First of all, it is important to keep in mind always that crypto assets usually represent some traditional legal relationship. This is evident when talking about direct tokenization of securities. Indeed, looking at tokenization both from an empirical point of view and from a legal point of view reveals something that I've alluded before, which is tokenized form is basically just a new set of clothes. So the content is the same. It's the classic security, be it a share, be it a bond, or a fund unit, just as these bundles of rights and obligations were traditionally represented in paper and in the 20th century evolved to book entry securities. So now we are, once again, before a new technological jump which might be comparable. And in my view, but I know this is not consensual. Tokenization securities are as much things as book entry or paper-based securities and can be firmly placed in the continental tradition of titles of credit as representations of more or less complex bundles of rights and/or obligations. Well, but enough about what happens abroad. What about here? Should Portuguese law follow the lead? Well, on the state of the art, as we speak, Portuguese securities law has no explicit framework for direct tokenization of securities. Article 46 of the Securities Code is clear in saying that securities are either paper-based or book entry securities, the former represented in a paper document and the latter in a registry in an account. So that's the first point. Second point is that Portuguese law is, of course, integrated in the wider EU law framework, so it would fall under the first category that I've mentioned of acknowledging tokenized securities without having a bespoke regime for them. And according to a joint reading of MiCA and MiFID II, the fact that the underlying technology is a DLT does not exclude the qualification of a financial instrument or a security as such. The double regime in EU law, according to which crypto assets are separated between MiCA, if they're utility, monetary, stablecoin, and so forth, and MiFID and financial regulation, if they are securities, applies also in Portugal. And actually, CMVM has been saying this since 2018, so kudos for them. MiCA and MiFID, of course, confirm this, and the DLT pilot regime also applies. So basically, should we maybe talk about tokenized securities as a new form of book entry securities? Let's get back to the Securities Code. Article 46 does say that book entry securities are those represented by a registry in an account, though it does not define the technological form of that account. My good friend João here has argued before, and very thoughtfully so, that this is so wide that a registry in a DLT could very much fit here. This is further supported by Article 65, where it is stated that registries for these kinds of securities are made in, I quote, computer format and can consist of coded references. Super vague, but super helpful as well. DLT registration is in a computer format and consists of coded references. Of course, this drafting, nobody was thinking about that back in '99, but this is super future-proof, so once again, great legal drafting. And this could be, and I'm not being ironic, as you can imagine. This could also, of course, one could always argue that account requires a custodian on an intermediary architecture. Of course, I'm aware of that possible counter-argument. In any case, assuming tokenized securities can be subsumed to the wider definition of book entry securities under Portuguese law, one major issue is the form of their registration, because Article 61 provides for 3 types of registration: account opened with a financial intermediary integrated in a centralized system, which is mandatory for securities being negotiated and traded in a stock market, for instance, or an MTF. Of course, this could be problematic for tokenized securities traded in trading platforms. But Decree Law 66/2023, that executes the DLT pilot regime in Portugal, specifically exempts this obligation for DLT financial instruments, unless the issuer wants to. Of course, it's temporary, but given the head start given by the DLT pilot regime in tearing down intermediation obligations in trading venues, this could be an interesting rule to stay. In an account, then we have the second option, account opened before a single financial intermediary indicated by the issuer, which is mandatory also for certain securities, Article 63. The Decree Law 66/2023 explicitly recognizes this for DLT pilot regime infrastructures. Otherwise, in other situations, the DLT registry can just be kept by the issuer or by an intermediary in the issuer's behalf, giving ample flexibility to the issuer. Of course, we would need some adaptation of some of the registry rules, like Article 68, Article 71 on transfer between accounts as well, but otherwise, the remaining provisions seem quite adaptable to tokenized securities. For instance, Article 48 and the following articles on conversion between paper-based securities and book entry securities don't seem to present any hindrance. In this case, the issuer decides on conversion, supports costs, publishes a conversion decision. Book entry securities can also be converted to paper form if the registry is cancelled. The token would be burned by the issuer in that case. And the other way around, conversion from paper-based securities seems quite easy. Article 55 and the followings on legitimacy is also pretty clear. Whomever is the owner of a unit according to the registry, in this case the registry would be the DLT, is legitimized to exercise all rights connected to the security, including voting and dividend rights and legitimacy to transfer. Article 58 on good faith acquirers would probably need a small calibration, maybe, in order to give the DLT the primacy in determining the owner, in this case. Articles 80 on transfer could also easily be used, In this case, it talks about an account, but you could interpret that as a wallet. And specific DLT might need, of course, specific DLTs might, of course, need smart contracts to allow pledges, for instance, because smart contracts can easily do that work. So, to finish? Yeah, sorry. That is the last question. I'm aware it's a lot. So do we even need to change anything? With this in mind, I would say that tokenized securities could already work well under existing rules for book entry securities, as many of them are perfectly adaptable to tokenized securities and are written in a future-proof way. Of course, some adaptations would be needed, but the rules are there and they can be used. Doing nothing would also be less legally disruptive, that is true. However, there could also be benefits in following the lead of France, Germany, and Spain, or other jurisdictions as Liechtenstein and Switzerland, in recognizing the tokenized form as the third form of representation. First of all, clarity and legal security for market operators, being able to rely on a specific rule that says tokenized securities are the same or have the same legal status as other securities, of course, has its advantages. That is true, even though that is theoretically and technically unnecessary, maybe. But it can give market operators some peace of mind. In any case, creating a third special category of tokenized securities could very well require deep changes to the securities code, which would be a hassle. And also, the securities code has successfully kept that part quite unchanged since '99. A good compromise could be treating tokenized securities as a subtype of book entry securities. In fact, as we saw, the Portuguese framework for book entry securities is fairly future-proof and looks at registry in a very broad manner. Surgical changes, of course, would be needed in some cases. Or, as an alternative, we could find a fourth type of registration in Article 61 of exclusive DLT registration. That could also be a possible way, which does not preclude issuers of using the other registry types if they want, but if they want to exclusively issue on a DLT, and if it doesn't fall under some of the mandatory registration types for some securities, it would be perfectly fine, in my opinion. So we could also adapt the registro em conta in Article 46 and adapt some rules for book entry securities. And in fact, and I promise I'm concluding, in fact, if we look closer at the French, the German, and the Spanish examples, they do not necessarily set apart the tokenized securities that much from book entry securities. In fact, for instance, in France, there seems to be no paper-based securities, from my understanding, so it's either securities registered in an account or in a DLT. In Germany, which didn't have that tradition until now, both are treated as electronic securities and have many of the same rules, then with specific rules for each type, but they have a set of common rules. Even though Spain treats DLT-based securities as a third category, many provisions are also common, so that's a possible way forward as well. In any case, both our legislator and the CMVM have an interesting choice ahead, balancing the minimization of disruption and taking advantage of the future-proof nature of the current provisions, but also acknowledging the need to ensure an explicit recognition of tokenized securities for legal certainty. As I said, tokenization is just probably another technological jump comparable to the jump from paper to book entry form. It remains to be seen whether it is a shorter jump or if it is as big as a leap. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for both of you. Very insightful presentations. For a question of time, I'll make one question and then open to the public. I'd like to make a connection with the first panel, where Marta talked about digital platforms. Hugo and Sami talked about the rethinking regulation. The digital platforms make me think about another phenomenon besides tokenization, that is the platformization, or maybe Uberization, if to speak about the company. But there is probably an alignment between these two phenomena, and it looks like you can have this variation of tokenization of securities, of crypto assets, of tokenization of rights, goods, service, anything, and all have it in all one place. This is what you're seeing. You're seeing a reshaping of the digital world in general, not only in the financial services, of having everything in one place. And what I would like to ask you is that you see this reality as risky. Should regulation restrain many of these uses, or should we rethink regulation in these new models? and we have regulation very fragmented. Do you see that we should maybe align all these regulations because we are seeing everything get connected? You see tokens of everything being distributed in the same way, but being regulated in different forms.
I mean, I can start. I would say that having everything in one place should not be theoretically a problem if the pieces that compose this one system have its own kind of set of rules set apart. So let's say, as we were saying, like the ledger itself, it's not now for the EU law considered as a legal representation of the financial instrument, so ownership problem. And then we have what we said before, and the first panel also said about the accountability of it. Like, okay, we use oracles, we use it all. So once you start mixing all of this in one single platform, all of these single risks of the technology itself also get exponentialized because you have a lot bigger exposure, and then you also start touching consumers, which then adds another layer to it. So in my view, as long as each of the pieces are somewhat regulated, it should be fine to have everything in one platform. But I think we are various steps before even reaching this place. We haven't even fully digitalized yet one piece of it. Imagine having it all in one single platform. I mean, for us as consumers, and it's also in the legal field, that would be great, because then you analyze one thing as a whole instead of trying to piece it out different projects, which turns more complex. But I think we are leeways away from this. But as a goal to reach out, I think it's great, and I don't think it's a problem by itself.
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think it touches upon two interesting issues around platformization in general, how it applies to tokens. The first one is something that has been discussed since the MiCA proposal came out, so 6 years ago, which is the right way to regulate this. Because at this moment, we do have like a kind of regime split oriented by the technological neutrality principle. So, okay, tokens that are securities are subject to securities law. The other tokens, in most cases, are subject to MiCA, or MiCA excludes them expressly. And that, of course, has advantages, but that also has disadvantages. Why should because MiCA is basically a mini MiFID prospectus regulation, a market abuse regulation, all bundled into like a lighter and simpler regime, except for the stablecoins part, which is a bit more complicated. But for the rest, it's basically meshing up all those three, meshing up in a good way, not necessarily in a bad way, meshing up the other three and putting them into a regulation. So first question is, as tokenization expands and as platforms who tokenize everything emerge, should we put them all in kind of a MiCA type regime and leave the investment tokens or the security tokens with a financial regulation, for instance? Well, sorry, I don't know what's going on. Yeah, it's the platformization of microphones. So that's the first question. And the second question is that even desirable? So let's imagine that in, I don't know, in 10 years, we'll have tokenized real estate, we'll have tokenized, service contracts. Should they, because if you think about it, if you look at MiCA, when it's not stablecoins, most of the rules are pretty light for issuance, for instance. For utility tokens, many of them are exempt. So what would we be regulating? Is it something for a MiCA-like instrument to regulate? And then that leads me to the second point, which is why there might be more political or economical, which is that desirable from a social or economic point of view? Well, of course, it's easier for consumers to have everything in the same place, but are we risking to expand the phenomenon, this kind of techno-feudal reality that we have in part also, with the big platforms, with the big cloud platforms in which, even mid-sized or even large companies are dependent on a small group of service providers that centralize everything. You can do anything nowadays without Google or without Apple. And of course, with the geopolitical climate, with America not necessarily geopolitically aligned with Europe, is that even desirable? Is that safe? So, but that's more of either a competition law kind of concern of should we leave it all to one platform? And of course, more of like political concern.
Can I just add I think it's funny because every time we are in one of these panels, it seems like the same discussions we were having with Mika in the beginning, and it's exactly the same discussions in the beginning of Mika where everyone was making the same comparisons between DLT and crypto, Web3 and tokenization to internet, buying shares on apps, and you know the super apps, especially in Asia, where you have everything in one app from banking to trading platforms to delivering food to supermarket to, okay, do we want super apps? So it's funny because the law advanced so much in the last 6 years, but somewhat we keep having the same discussions of, do we want this? It's the current regulation enough? And then in the other side of it, everyone is saying, oh, we're already over-regulating because this was made to not be regulated at all. So I think we are always in this little kind of loop.
No, that is true. Thank you so much for your interesting responses. There is one already. Question from the public. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Hello, good afternoon. Does anyone hear me? It's good?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is for Dr. António Rolo. It seems to me that you forgot about Article 1st of the
Securities.
Securities Code. So there's a difference, as you know, between rights and their form of register. And I was hearing you with all my attention, and I was recalling all my studies from college and afterwards about it. And the reason that there are the articles 45, 46, 43, 61, 63, whatever, those are just registers. And of course, blockchain actually tokenization, it's a form of a register, but it's not a right, and it's not an instrumental, financial instrumental right. It's not on Article 40, it's on Article 1. Derivatives were not even on Article 1 from the first day, as you know. So I do gather your point. It's well fundamented, but we would need to change Article 1, I believe.
I also see. Thank you. That's
Article 2.
Article. Well, Article 2 we already have point or paragraph G, if I'm not mistaken.
In one.
But your question is also very interesting because it touches upon the distinction. But once again, that's a distinction that comes from I think the whole continental tradition of titles of credit, which is the separation between the instrument and the underlying right or the underlying bundle of rights and obligations. And of course, I think that in the case of a token representation, it doesn't work differently structurally. It doesn't work differently from for a security or even a traditional title of credit like a check or others, which now the English translation is escaping me because they're a bit old-fashioned. But like letters and whatnot. I don't know if it's letter, how you say. But in any case, I think the separation between the instrument which embodies and the bundle of rights and obligations that it is embodied works the same structurally between a paper, a book entry, and a DLT entry. So in that way, I think you're right. I probably should have mentioned also Article 1 and Article 2, but I agree with you. So there's this...
What about Article 10 from the Civil Code?
Sorry?
Article 10 from the Civil Code.
What do you think Article 10 has to do with this?
Well, we may have...
Analogy.
by analogy, yeah. We may have... Not analogy, actually. I would say, if I do recall it, I'm just quoting from my head. When you have a gap, a legal gap, the legal specialist has the option or well, actually it's a tool, it's a legal tool, Article 10 to require to look at the legal system and find a solution as the legislator would do it so. Yeah. So then you can resort to those articles in terms of register.
No, I do think...
Fill in the gap.
No, I think that what I've done, but well, agree to disagree if you disagree. What I have done would be in the app. I think it could be integration of a lacuna and an extensive interpretation. The border between the two is a bit hazy at times. So you could see taking DLT-based securities and considering them book entry securities. You could even consider an expansive interpretation. Or you could you could always argue that it's based on the letter of the law, like, okay, the law is vague and broad, so this could be considered to be within the letter of the law. But of course, if you do interpret the law as just restricted to traditional accounts, then of course you would have to recur to integration of lacunae and analogical reasoning. So yeah, no, fully agree.
Can I have 2 more questions?
Fire away.
Short ones.
Okay, simple one. The first one is, if we're having a tokenization of assets, and we can tokenize real life assets into the digital world. For example, my own house. No, better yet, a painting. I have a Picasso painting in my house, and I tokenize it. The tokens get traded partially, whatever. And then just a fire happens in my house and the painting just it doesn't exist anymore. What happens to the tokenization?
It follows the same as the real world asset. It's because
it would need me to go somewhere and say, well, I just lost my painting.
Then we have to separate the questions in 2 things. First, we will have to consider the ideal world on which the real world assets already linked to the rights of it. So it doesn't need a separate action on and off chain. It's one thing. So if those are 2 scenarios. If it's all linked in one single act, and therefore by buying that asset, you already have the right to it, that means that whatever happened to the real asset also happens to the token. So if the real asset gets destroyed, the token will need to get, well, not deleted, but will have to be disposed as well, because it will have no real value, because the real world asset doesn't exist anymore per se, because it got on fire. And then we'll have the legal folding of it. That is, most likely when we reach this, we'll have already insurance that will cover those. I mean, if you have a Picasso art, you probably already have insured, and that will reflect on the token as well. That already happens, by the way. If you go to the US, there are already a bunch of paintings, Michael Jackson memorabilia that are already on token. And in the fine print of the token, you already have if that asset is insured or not, where it is holded, and all of the fine prints of it. It's a normal contract, so one thing will follow the other. However, if it's in 2 separate moments, then yes. If you're right, it's not on-chain, therefore it's in a traditional paper registry that will have to take action from you. So if that got on paper, you need to go to, so it got on fire, you need to go to the register and then report that on chain. So there is no discrepancies between them, and then yeah, it's a separate moment.
So that would mean that most common things that are not registered would get some kind of register that would automate the real world with the digital world. For example, an insurance, since you claim the insurance company would go for the register, the digital register, and say this doesn't exist anymore, so swipe it out.
I mean, it's a digital ledger, so everything needs to be booked there. So yes, the insurance company, in the first scenario where everything is integrated, it will be, in theory, the insurance company will be the one that will put this input that this doesn't exist anymore and that there is a claim on that. And everything will need to be on chain. So once you access that real world asset on chain, you'll have the full information from the first purchase to whatever insurance, to the destruction, to the dysfunctionality of that token specifically. So it doesn't get resold empty. So everything should be there, should be a full, complete ledger of that one asset.
Okay. Can I just
one question.
Can I just add something to the second question?
Yeah.
I think that's the reason why tokenization of intangible assets, or tokenization of rights, of obligations, of values is much easier and much more intuitive than tokenization of tangible assets. Of course, everybody likes to say that, oh, we're tokenizing gold, we're tokenizing real estate, sheep, whatever. But the problem with that is precisely the structural problem of how, because it's easy to say that it's easy to look at a share or a bond or a fund unit and say, okay, it exists in this registry, so that is the primary form to determine its ownership. The primary or the only form, that's easy. The challenging part is, for instance, real estate or gold, because, well, first of all, most tokenization proposals that are out there are indirect, so, basically on top of an SPV, on top of a stablecoin, something like that. And the thing is, you always have to deal with the dissociation between the empirical, the physical plane, and of course the ledger. For instance, even in Liechtenstein, but correct me if I'm wrong, because I have not read the law for a couple of months, in the Liechtenstein law, even for real estate, because Liechtenstein, sometimes people say, oh, they allow tokenized real estate, direct ownership in REM rights, etc. But you always have to have a compatibility and an association with the land registry itself. So it's not a pure or native or fully direct tokenization. And also Liechtenstein doesn't have a lot of space for real estate.
It's not that much land.
Very quick. No? Very quick, please.
This tool serves more, I would say, in a simple term, the rich man or the common man. Because I don't see most common people having a necessity to tokenize their assets. I see that big fortunes do have a necessity. So, who are we serving here with this solution? Where are we going?
I think it depends of what you call necessity per se, because, I mean, I would say 80% of things that we do in the internet are not a necessity to any human beings, and yeah, we are doing it. So I think that once we're in the experts field of it, we discuss about of the theory and the technical part of the technology itself, not so much of the implications, I think. The same way, as the internet was before. I mean, we don't see here us discussing the code of internet for the sake of it. So on the day-to-day, I think there will be, the common man will start having more implications once we kind of disassociate the technology from what we have in the day-to-day. But I mean, you can see, and that happens a lot already in the music industry more than any other. People they're a fan of someone, they want a memorabilia. I mean, that's the big case in the US. People are buying like Michael Jackson things left and right. Maybe you as an individual will not, as a common man, will not have the means to buy something, but you're really fan, you really want to be part of it, so you do it. In Europe, we have that already with soccer clubs that have, the tokens, like the fan tokens. I mean, do you need that? Not really, but if you're part of that community, sometimes you feel closer to that, you feel more integrated. So I think we have, needs to the common man that will be different than the needs of the richer people. Once we are talking more about community belonging, the other ones we are talking about, well, the taxes and structure of it. So different ways of using the same technology, but need is it's a strong word. I don't think we.
Luiza, I was just checking if there is another person that is interested in intervening. Just for a last question. If not, we are also here ending our time. So I thank you both, Luiza and António. Thank you so much, and we'll have the pleasure of hearing now the closing remarks from Inês Drummond, Vice Chair of the Management Board of CMVM. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you. Let me begin by expressing my sincere appreciation by all those that made this event possible. To our speakers, Hugo, Sami, Marta, Luiza, António, thanks a lot for the rigor, for the depth, for the intellectual generosity that you brought to this seminar. I think that the quality of your work and the richness of today's debate reflect the very best of what academic and policy-oriented work can offer. So thanks a lot. To our moderators, Elizabetth and João, thanks a lot for guiding both panels. To Luís, thank you for opening up this session and guiding us throughout it. And a special thank to DIC, to our communication department, for organizing the entire event in such a short period of time, and to João for having this idea as CMVM Innov coordinator. Thanks a lot. And finally, to all participants, of course, that both those that are here in person and those that have joined us remotely, and your presence made this a truly interesting debate. So basically, we had two panels today. I will try to summarize a bit the main ideas that were put forward in both panels. I'm pretty sure that a smart contract is much simpler than my notes, but I will try to I will try to conclude in a very short way. So first we have basically, I think, one of the most central questions, which was if DLT delivers or not disintermediation, right? So we were expecting basically cleaner, a simpler financial architecture with fewer investors and fewer issuers. But the first panel actually showed us that the reality is much more complex and nuanced than that. So rather than eliminating intermediaries, tokenization often reshapes them, giving rise to new actors, new concentration risks, new forms of intermediation or reintermediation that frequently sit outside the traditional regulatory perimeter. So Hugo and Sami started by presenting us with a very interesting analytical framework for better understanding this new context. If you remember, they started by describing 3 different scenarios to which capital markets may evolve to, and depending on the degree of openness and the rate of adoption. And actually, we will have different market participants. We'll have intermediaries still, end users and information providers. And then they move to these 3 case studies, taking into account 3 possible models: the traditional model, the disintermediation model that actually brings a lot of disruption to financial activities, and finally the reintermediation model, which leads to new market players that may or may not be regulated, they may or may not be subject to authorization. And then Sami concluded that actually something that actually is like, Luiza was saying that actually we move in a loop, because Sami was concluding that you need a holistic perspective to regulation and supervision. That was basically what we were saying after the financial crisis, right? So basically going back to old times. Then Marta drew our attention to a very interesting conceptual distinction between trust in institutions and trust in technology or algorithmics. I think that maybe we are moving not from an institutional trust to an algorithmic trust, but to an institutional trust, to a context which actually combines both the institutional trust and the algorithmic trust. And she also mentioned that in a small market such in Portugal, rather than the migration of economic, or rather than the elimination of intermediaries, what we may have is actually the migration of economic and informational power to new operators that might be outside the traditional regulatory perimeter, and she actually emphasizes all the challenges that this context involves to supervision. Actually, we have regulatory challenges related to the reintermediation, such as concentration, access to data, territorial approach of regulation and opacity, and the need for a hybrid entity and activity-based approach to regulation, which I think is not, we are not there yet in Europe. Then we have a panel to reply Pedro Maquia's question in the first panel, which was about legal certainty, right? So we had a specific panel for this topic. Luiza presented a very interesting, I would say, supervision-focused framework for assessing DLT-based market architectures, in terms also in comprising different features, but focusing a lot on the legal robustness of each one of these potentially architecture or DLT-based market architecture. I think that the comparative analysis of the EU DLT pilot, the Switzerland Act or DLT Act, and the UK Financial Market Infrastructure Sandbox, aligned with other international initiatives, was particularly valuable also to identify common issues, notably core institutional functions that should and still apply, but also identifying challenges, including the legal certainty, that are applicable to each one of them, and also for supervisors. And finally, António guided us to perhaps one of the most fundamental legal questions that we have, which is, can the tokenized form become a primary legal recognized representation of securities under the existing law? I think is comparison between the transition from paper-based to bank entry securities towards the context that we face right now, which is a transition from bank book entry to tokenized form, was a very interesting one. He mentioned some examples of countries that actually changed their securities law in order to adjust it to this new form of securities, the tokenization of securities. And then when it comes to the Portuguese situation, it reminds me a bit of an economist. It depends, right? So basically we have rules that can be used and that should be used, but we have other legal options that actually can bring more legal certainty, and probably we should think a bit more about this. So I think that actually what these panels, or the two panels, showed is that we have a lot of things to discuss, right? And I think that this kind of initiatives that we have organized makes all sense, because it's basically a way to have a context in which supervisors, regulators, legislators, market participants, the academia can work in tandem in order to have some clarity on these issues. At the CMVM, we firmly believe that fostering innovation in capital markets requires regulators and supervisors to engage proactively and systematically with the relevant market participants to address issues whose applicability, as was shown today, to capital markets remains not fully clear. Regulatory uncertainty, if left unaddressed, undermines innovation. It creates fragmentation in the market. It exposes market participants to unclear rules and gradually erodes the level playing field, as you know, is key for the effectiveness of supervision. And in a context marked by so much uncertainty, like the one we have today, right? We just see the news and you see that they are always changing. Actually, today, it seems that they are becoming a bit better, but we never know what will happen tomorrow. Our role as supervisors should be to reduce uncertainty as much as possible, within, of course, the scope of our mandate, in order to support the sustained development of the market. This is the conviction that lies at the heart of CMVM Innov, which is our institutional framework for engaging with financial innovation. We launched CMVM Innov in 2022, and it became our primary channel for interacting with innovators, with entrepreneurs, and with market participants. It's very interesting that since its launch, we have received many information requests, and the vast majority, around 70% of the requests that we have received, are related with DLT, are related to tokenization, are related to tokenization of financial instruments. So it makes all sense to be here discussing these issues. In 2025, we decided to undertake a significant redesign of the CMVM Innov. It was basically a strategic priority that we set for that year. And our aim was precisely to move for a more, I would say, reactive model to a more proactive model, and in which a coordinated approach to understanding how innovation is basically affecting capital markets became central. And today's initiative is a good example of that. CMVM Innov thus complements Portugal FinLab, as we know, the innovation hub that was created by the 3 financial supervisors, and allow us basically to address the diverse needs of the market in relation to financial innovation. Just to finish, let me turn to what lies ahead. So the core logic of CMVM Innov rests on a simple principle. A supervisor that deeply understands innovation is a better supervisor, better at protecting investors, better at promoting market integrity, better at contributing to sustainable market development, better too at providing the clarity for market participants that need and want to innovate. With this in mind, we have several work streams that are now in place. So first, we'll have the publication of the papers that were presented today in one of the editions of Caderno do Mercado de Valores Mobiliários, so our CMVM's Securities Market Review, which is an important step in making this academic and policy work accessible to a wider audience. On the artificial intelligence, which is another defining technology of our time, I would like to highlight that actually we have participated in ESMA recent survey to assess how AI was being used by our supervised entities. And just a short remark, 25% of the responses to ESMA survey was actually given or provided by the entities that we supervise by the CMVM. So we have a lot of information to have a clear view on the national landscape and having more information for our supervisory actions. And we will also provide some information about the Portuguese responses to this questionnaire. Beyond these initiatives, we are also investing in broadening the reach of CMVM Innov through information sessions at innovation hubs, through new communication formats, and through our continued participation in Portugal FinLab. Our mission for 2026 and the years ahead is not only to keep up with innovation, but to do that under a context that incentivizes in a systematic way the interaction between supervisors, regulators, other market participants, academia, policymakers, and other international partners. A supervisor that does not merely react, but contributes meaningful to shaping innovation in ways that are sustainable, transparent, and aligned with the deeper purposes of capital markets. We live today, I think, in my opinion, of course, today's seminars with more clarity, more questions to be answered, and more valuable connections than when we arrived. So I would argue that this was a very successful event. On behalf of the CMVM, thank you once again to all our speakers, moderators, and participants. We look forward to continuing working with you on these important issues. Thank you very much.